In the summer of 1976, a 16-year-old girl walked less than half a mile to buy a soda and never came home. Her body was found the next morning on the side of a road in DuPage County, Illinois, sexually assaulted and strangled. For 44 years, no one was charged. No one was held accountable. And then, in 2020, a laboratory in Virginia looked at DNA that had been sitting in an evidence freezer since the Ford administration and built a face. That face belonged to a man who had been dead for nearly 40 years. What happened next made history in the state of Illinois, and it raises a question that should unsettle every single one of us. How many other killers died free because the science simply didn't exist yet? Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. This case happened in a quiet Illinois suburb, and it could have happened anywhere. The summer of 1976 felt like the tail end of something. The Vietnam War had ended the year before, and America was still processing what that meant. The country had just turned 200 years old, and the bicentennial celebrations were barely fading from memory. On the radio, Fleetwood Mac's rumors was everywhere. Suburbs like Lisle and Woodridge, sitting quietly in DuPage County, just west of Chicago, felt like exactly the kind of places where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Neat streets, ranch houses, kids on bikes. The kind of place parents felt safe letting their teenagers walk to the corner store. Pamela Maurer was 16 years old that August. She was a girl who laughed easily, the kind of teenager who kept her friendships close and her plans simple. On the evening of August 22nd, she was at a friend's house. It was a warm night. She decided she wanted a soda. The store was not far. She had walked that kind of distance 100 times before. She told her friend she would be right back. She was wearing a light-colored top. She stepped outside into the late summer air. The walk should have taken minutes. It took her the rest of her life. The sequence F what happened that night was reconstructed piece by piece in the days that followed, and it told a story of terrifying speed. Pamela left her friend's house sometime in the early evening. She was heading toward a nearby store, a route that took her along roads she knew, in a neighborhood she had no reason to fear. Somewhere along that walk, in the growing dark of an August night, someone stopped her, or approached her, or was already waiting. By the next morning, August 23rd, her body had been found on the side of a road in Woodridge. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. She was 16 years old, and she was dead, and the soda she had walked out to buy was never purchased. The details that investigators found at the scene told them this was not random in the way people use that word to comfort themselves. This took time. This was done by someone who was not afraid of being seen, or who had calculated that no one would see. The medical examiner established cause of death. Sexual assault evidence was collected. DNA, though the science to fully exploit it did not yet exist, was preserved. Someone at the DuPage County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would matter 44 years later. They kept it. The most devastating fact about Pamela Maurer's murder is not what was done to her. It is that the man who did it walked away. He got in a car or walked down a road, and he went back to his life. And he stayed there, living freely for the next 5 years, until death took him by other means, still having never answered for what he did on that August night in 1976. The investigation that followed Pamela's murder was, by the standards of the time, thorough. Detectives canvassed the area. They interviewed people who knew her, people who live along the route she would have taken, anyone who might have seen something. The DuPage County Sheriff's Office worked the case. Tips came in. Tips were followed. Nothing held. No suspect was named. No arrest was made. The case did not close, it stalled. And then, as months became years, it did what cold cases do. It accumulated distance. Investigators who had worked it retired or moved to other assignments. The witnesses who might have remembered something began to forget, or moved away, or died. The paper files thickened and then sat. The systemic failure here was not unique to DuPage County, and it was not the result of negligence. It was the result of a fundamental limitation. In 1976, DNA evidence was legally and scientifically useless. The technology to create a DNA profile did not exist yet. The first use of DNA in a criminal case anywhere in the world would not happen until 1986, a full decade after Pamela died. Even after DNA profiling became possible, the databases that make modern genetic genealogy work would not exist for decades more. Investigators in 1976 were working with what 1976 had. And what 1976 had was not enough. That is the systemic truth beneath this case. It is not that someone failed Pamela Maurer. It is that the era failed her. The tools that could have identified her killer simply did not exist. And so the case went cold in the way that a fire goes cold. Not with a single moment of failure, but slowly, degree by degree, until one day you reach for warmth and find only ash. Cold cases do not survive on institutional memory alone. They survive because someone refuses to let them die. For decades, the name Pamela Maurer remained in the records of the DuPage County Sheriff's Office. Her case was never officially closed. At various points over the years, investigators returned to it, looked at the file, looked at what evidence remained, looked at whether anything new could be done. The answer for a long time was no. But the evidence that had been collected in 1976 remained preserved. That decision, to keep it, to maintain it, to not discard what seemed like it might never matter, was the single most important administrative act in this entire story. Because of that choice, when the science finally arrived, there was still something to test. Pamela's family carried the weight of those decades. A daughter, a sister, a friend, gone at 16, and no one held responsible. The not knowing is a particular kind of suffering that doesn't diminish with time the way people hope it will. Every year that passed without an answer was another year her family lived with that open wound. In 2019, DuPage County investigators made a decision to submit the preserved DNA evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic genomics company based in Reston, Virginia. It was not a Hail Mary. It was a calculated decision, made possible by the fact that the science had finally caught up with the evidence. Here is how this works, in plain terms. Your DNA is a biological instruction manual. It contains information about what you look like, the shape of your face, the color of your eyes, the tone of your skin, how your features are arranged. For most of human history, investigators could look at DNA from a crime scene and tell you almost nothing about the person it came from, beyond whether it matched another sample. The DNA either matched a known person or it didn't. Parabon Nanolabs changed that equation with a process called phenotype prediction, sometimes called DNA phenotyping. Their system, called Snapshot, analyzes specific markers in a DNA sample and uses them to generate a physical description of the unknown person. Not a guess. A statistical model built on tens of thousands of data points, trained on the relationship between genetic markers and physical appearance. The result is a composite image, a reconstructed face, of someone investigators have never seen, built entirely from the biological material they left behind. There's a second tool that Parabon uses, and it is arguably more powerful. It is called investigative genetic genealogy. This is the same science that solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018. When a DNA sample from a crime scene is uploaded to a genealogy database, a database where ordinary people have submitted their own DNA to learn about their ancestry, the system looks for partial matches. Not a perfect match to the killer, but matches to the killer's relatives. Distant cousins, second cousins, people who share a percentage of DNA with the unknown subject because they share a common ancestor. From those matches, genealogists begin building family trees. They trace the branches forward through time, looking for a male relative of the right age who lived in the right location at the right time. This process can take months. When it works, it is extraordinary. In Pamela Maurer's case, both tools were used. Parabon ran the DNA through their phenotype prediction system. The face that came back, the reconstructed face of the man whose DNA was found at the scene. bore a striking resemblance to a man named Bruce Lindahl. Investigators knew who Bruce Lindahl was. Or rather, they knew what he was. Bruce Lindahl was a man from the northern Illinois area who had already come to the attention of investigators for reasons that had nothing to do with Pamela Maurer. He was a suspected serial killer. He had been linked to the deaths and disappearances of multiple young women in Illinois during the 1970s. He had never been charged with murder. He had never stood trial. And in 1981, 5 years after Pamela Maurer was strangled on a road in Woodridge, Bruce Lindahl died. The cause was a drug overdose. He was gone before the science that could have caught him existed. He spent his entire adult life, from the murder of Pamela Maurer until his death, without ever being held accountable. When the phenotype image came back looking like Lindahl, investigators did not call it solved. That is not how this works. A reconstructed face is a lead, not a conviction. What they needed was confirmation, a direct DNA comparison between the crime scene sample and a verified biological relative of Bruce Lindahl. Genealogists went to work. They built the family tree. They identified living relatives of Bruce Lindahl. And then, with the cooperation of those relatives, they obtained a DNA sample that could be compared directly to the DNA preserved from 1976. The comparison confirmed it. The DNA found at the scene where Pamela Maurer was murdered matched Bruce Lindahl's biological profile. Not probably, not likely, matched. In February of 2020, DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin and Sheriff James Mindrick stood before cameras and announced that the 44-year-old murder of Pamela Maurer had been solved. The killer was Bruce Lindahl. He had been dead for 39 years. This was the first time in Illinois history that investigative genetic genealogy had been used to solve a murder case. Not the first time the technique had been used in the country, but the first time in Illinois. The case became a landmark, cited by investigators and prosecutors across the state as proof that the science worked, that old evidence was worth preserving, and that no case was truly cold as long as biological material survived. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. Bruce Lindahl could not be charged. He could not be sentenced. He could not be made to sit in a courtroom and listen to what he had done. The law does not reach past death, and that is a fact Pamela's family had to absorb alongside the resolution itself. What they received instead was something different from justice in the legal sense, and they had to decide for themselves whether it was enough. They received a name. They received certainty. They received confirmation that they had not been wrong to keep asking, that the case had not gone cold because Pamela was forgotten or because her life didn't matter, but because the science simply hadn't existed yet. And now it did. And it had answered the question they had been carrying for 44 years. DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin stated publicly that the identification brought resolution to a case that has haunted this community for decades, and that the result demonstrated the power of modern forensic science to reach back across time. Pamela's family, in statements released after the announcement, expressed relief, the complicated, incomplete relief of people who have waited a very long time for an answer that arrived too late to change anything, but mattered anyway. 3 lessons come directly out of what happened to Pamela Maurer and what it took to finally answer her case. First, biological evidence must be preserved indefinitely, regardless of whether current technology can use it. The decision made in 1976 to keep Pamela's DNA evidence was not made with any knowledge of genetic genealogy. It was made by people who had no way of knowing the science that would eventually exist. They preserved it anyway. That decision is the reason this case was solved. If your family is connected to an unsolved case, and you have any influence over what happens to the physical evidence, you advocate for its preservation with the same urgency you would bring to any other decision in the case. Evidence that appears useless today may be the key to everything in 5 or 10 or 20 years. The DuPage County Sheriff's Office preserved that sample for 44 years. That is the model. Second, investigative genetic genealogy is now a legitimate, proven tool, but it requires DNA databases with enough contributors to generate meaningful matches. The reason this technique works is because millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry services. When a distant relative of a killer submits their DNA to learn about their heritage, they may unknowingly become the link that identifies a murderer. This is not surveillance. It is a web of biological connection that investigators can navigate when a crime scene sample exists. If you have submitted DNA to an ancestry service and you're wondering whether your information could be used this way, in many cases, yes, it can. Some databases require law enforcement to opt in. Others allow uploads directly. The Golden State Killer was identified this way. Pamela Mora's killer was identified this way. The database matters. Third, for families of cold case victims who have been told there is nothing left to do, there may now be something left to do. Organizations like the DNA Doe Project and Parabon Nanolabs work with law enforcement agencies on exactly these cases. If your family is connected to an unsolved case from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or beyond, and biological evidence was collected and preserved, it is worth contacting your local law enforcement agency and specifically asking whether the evidence has been submitted for genetic genealogy analysis. Not DNA profiling. That is the older technology. Genetic genealogy. Those are different things. Asking the right question gets you to the right answer faster. Pamela Mora walked out of a friend's house on a warm August evening in 1976 to buy a soda. She was 16 years old. She had her whole life in front of her. The man who took that life from her spent the next 5 years living freely and then died. And for 39 years after that, the world continued turning without ever knowing his name in connection to hers. And then science caught up. 44 years later, in a laboratory in Virginia, a face was rebuilt from molecules. A family tree was traced through generations. A name was confirmed by biology. And for the first time in Illinois history, genetic genealogy looked back across nearly half a century and said, "We know who did this." It was not the ending Pamela deserved. The ending she deserved was a different August evening, one where she walked to the store, bought her soda, walked back to her friend's house, and came home. That ending was taken from her. But this one, the one that came 44 years late, still mattered. It mattered to her family. It mattered to the investigators who had kept her file alive. And it matters to the history of how this country uses science to pursue accountability, even when decades stand between the crime and the answer. If you know of a cold case in your community where biological evidence was collected and never fully tested with modern tools, leave the case name in the comments. Someone watching might know something or know someone who does. These cases survive because communities refuse to let them disappear.